My name is Chloe, and at 34 years old, I was used to my family treating me like a complete failure. We were sitting in a private dining room at a high-end steakhouse celebrating my sister Jasmine and her husband Trent. Between bites of dry-aged ribeye, my mother Patricia leaned forward with a smirk and said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, "She is just a hospital receptionist, Trent, so please do not use big medical terms with her. She gets easily confused." My Aunt Sarah wiped her mouth and sneered, adding that at least it is honest work for someone who threw her life away and dropped out of law school 14 years ago. I simply sipped my sparkling water and smiled. But by the end of the dinner, my emergency hospital pager would go off with a code black, revealing my true position as the chief of neurosurgery, right before my aunt collapsed on the floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit through a family dinner while being disrespected. Growing up, my sister Jasmine was the golden child. She could do no wrong in my mother's eyes. I was the dark-skinned daughter who refused to follow the strict path my mother laid out. When I left the law program they chose for me, they cut me off completely. They assumed I spent the last 14 years working the front desk at Memorial Hospital. I let them believe it because my peace of mind was always more important than their validation. That night at the steakhouse, the crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow, but the atmosphere at our table was freezing cold. Trent, my white brother-in-law, who always carried himself with an unbearable arrogance, was holding court. He worked as a medical device sales director and loved to flaunt his wealth. He wore a custom-tailored suit and spoke to the waitstaff like they were entirely beneath him. As the dinner wound down, Trent pulled out a crisp $50 bill and tossed it across the white tablecloth right in front of me. He looked at me with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl. "Hey, Chloe," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Why do you not do us a favor and run out to the valet stand to fetch my car ticket? Keep the 50. I know things must be incredibly tight on a receptionist's salary, and Jasmine and I want to make sure you can pay your rent this month." Cruel laughter erupted around the table. Jasmine giggled and rested her head on Trent's shoulder, looking at me as if I were a tragic charity case. My mother beamed at Trent, clearly thrilled by his display of financial dominance over me. My Aunt Sarah muttered that I should be grateful for such a generous brother-in-law. The sheer disrespect hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not even break eye contact with Trent. I calmly pushed the $50 bill back across the table. "Keep your money, Trent," I said evenly. "Actually allow me to handle the dinner. It is the absolute least I can do for this family." Before anyone could process my words, I opened my purse and pulled out a solid metal black American Express Centurion card. I flagged down our waiter, who had been nervously hovering nearby, and handed it to him. I told him to put the entire $2,000 anniversary dinner on my tab and to add a generous 20% tip for his excellent service tonight. The laughter at the table died instantly. Trent stared at the heavy metal card in the waiter's hand, his smug smile vanishing. Jasmine sat up straight, her eyes darting between me and the waiter in total disbelief. My mother Patricia slammed her hand down on the table. "Chloe, what is this?" my mother demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Whose credit card is that? Are you stealing from the doctors at your hospital? If you get arrested for credit card fraud, do not expect us to bail you out. You are embarrassing this family." I looked my mother dead in the eye, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. "The card has my name on it, Mother," I replied smoothly. "I assure you, I can afford a steak dinner." Trent crossed his arms, his face turning an angry shade of red. "There is no way a front desk girl qualifies for a black card." He scoffed, trying desperately to regain his power. "You are probably drowning in massive consumer debt trying to pretend you are on our level. It is pathetic." I was just about to tell Trent exactly how I qualified for that exclusive card when a sharp, piercing sound cut through the tension. It was my hospital emergency pager. The buzzing was loud and relentless, echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. Trent let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Oh, look at this," he mocked loudly. The receptionist bought a fake pager to make herself look important. "What is the matter, Chloe? Is there an emergency spill at the front desk?" I ignored him completely and unclipped the device. The screen was flashing a bright, urgent red. The text scrolled across the small digital display in bold black letters. Code Black. Chief of Neurosurgery needed immediately. Severe trauma in emergency room Bay 1. I stood up from my chair and grabbed my coat. Sit down, Chloe, my mother snapped. We are not finished talking about this stolen credit card. I did not sit down. Instead, I turned the pager around and held it up so they could all clearly read the glowing red screen. Trent leaned in his eyes, scanning the words. Chief of Neurosurgery, he read aloud, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He looked up at me, all the color draining from his face. Jasmine let out a small gasp. My mother froze in place, unable to comprehend what she was looking at. Yes, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a scalpel. I am not the receptionist. I am the chief of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital, and I have to go save a life right now. Before I could take a step toward the exit, my Aunt Sarah let out a strange gasp. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She gripped the edge of the table tightly, and then her entire body went rigid. The wine glasses shattered as she collapsed sideways, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Her body began to convulse violently. The anniversary dinner had just turned into my emergency room. The moment my aunt hit the floor, the dining room erupted into chaos. My mother shrieked while Jasmine jumped onto her chair. Trent stepped forward, waving his hands, but did not kneel to help her. I dropped my purse and slid onto the floor. I turned her onto her side to prevent choking and slipped my jacket under her head. Get back, I ordered, keeping my voice steady. Give her some space right now. Trent grabbed my shoulder and tried to yank me backward. What are you doing, idiot? He barked, his face red with panic. Do not touch her. You are just a receptionist. You will get us sued. Let a real medical executive handle this. I shoved his hand off my shoulder with force. I am securing her airway, I snapped loudly. Time the seizure! Trent stood there, unable to comprehend that I was giving him orders. Within minutes, 2 paramedics rushed into the room carrying a stretcher. Trent stepped in front of them, blocking their path. Listen to me, he demanded, using his booming voice. I am Trent Sterling, Director of Medical Device Sales. I know what is happening here. This woman needs immediate transport to a private facility, so listen to my directives. The paramedics ignored him. They bypassed his tailored suit and knelt next to me. What do we have here? The lead paramedic asked, looking directly into my eyes. Tonic-clonic seizure lasting 4 minutes. I replied smoothly, feeling for her pulse. Her airway is clear, but her heart rate is erratic, and her pupils are sluggish. I suspect a subarachnoid hemorrhage. We need an immediate push of lorazepam and rapid transport to Memorial Hospital. I will call ahead to prep an operating room. The paramedics nodded, instantly recognizing the language of a senior physician. They carefully loaded my aunt onto the stretcher. Trent was furious. His face was a mask of pure privilege, offended that these workers were taking orders from a dark-skinned woman he considered beneath him. Hey! He shouted, pointing an angry finger. Did you not hear me? She answers phones for a living. Do not listen to her. Take my aunt to the private clinic right now. The lead paramedic stood up and gave Trent a hard, punishing look. Sir, step back now, or I will have the police escort you out in handcuffs. We are transporting the patient to Memorial Hospital because they are a level 1 trauma center and because this woman clearly knows what she is talking about. Now move out of the way. My mother and I rode in the back of the ambulance while Trent and Jasmine followed behind in his vehicle. The flashing red lights illuminated the tight space, casting harsh shadows across my mother's terrified face. Despite the critical condition of her sister, my mother turned her bitter venom toward me. She gripped the metal railing of the stretcher and glared at me with hatred. If Sarah dies tonight, it is entirely your fault, Chloe, she hissed, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. You always ruin absolutely everything. You had to cause a massive scene with that stolen credit card and stress her out. This is exactly why we cut you off when you were just 20 years old. You touch things and they break into pieces. You selfishly refused to go to the law school we chose for you because you thought you knew better, and look at you now. You are 34 years old playing doctor in the back of an ambulance like a foolish child. I ignored her. My eyes remained glued to the cardiac monitor, watching the erratic spikes and dips of my aunt's failing heart. "You have no idea what you are talking about, Mother," I said firmly. "Just pray she makes it to the hospital in time." When the ambulance stopped in the emergency bay of Memorial Hospital, the back doors swung open. Trent parked his vehicle and sprinted toward us, his face twisted in a smug, angry scowl. As the paramedics swiftly unloaded the stretcher, Trent grabbed my arm tightly, pulling me away from the doors. "Listen to me, you girl." He spat his breath against my face. "When we get inside this building, I am going straight to the hospital administrator. I do lucrative business with this hospital. I am going to have you fired from your front desk job before midnight strikes. You will be lucky to find work scrubbing toilets when I am done with you." I yanked my arm out of his grasp, smoothing my clothes with calm precision. "Do whatever you feel is necessary, Trent," I replied, and without fear. "But right now, I have an important job to do." I turned on my heel and walked toward the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. Trent scoffed loudly and followed right behind me. The automatic doors flew open, and the normally chaotic emergency room suddenly went completely still. It was as if time had frozen in place. Two long lines of medical residents, skilled nurses, and attending physicians stood firmly at attention, parting straight down the middle, like the waters of the Red Sea. No one looked at Trent. Every single eye in the room was locked respectfully onto me. The head nurse, Brenda, walked briskly down the center aisle carrying a pressed white lab coat. She held it out to me. "Dr. Chloe," she said, "we received your page. Trauma Bay 1 is prepped and the team is waiting." I slipped into the pristine coat. On the pocket read the words, "Dr. Chloe, Chief of Neurosurgery." I looked at Trent. His jaw dropped open in shock. Jasmine and Mother stepped through the doors, just in time to see the staff looking directly at me. "Are you still going to have me fired, Trent?" I asked, raising one eyebrow. "Because if you truly want to speak to the person in charge, you are looking right at her. Now get out of my trauma bay." I turned my back on them and walked toward the scrub sink, leaving them standing frozen in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay slid shut with a solid click, completely blocking me from their view. From that moment on, my focus was entirely on saving my aunt's life, but I would later learn from the security staff and nursing station exactly what happened in the family waiting room while I was holding a scalpel. A young nurse immediately ushered my mother, Jasmine, and Trent into the private surgical waiting area down the hall. The room was small and sterile with uncomfortable vinyl chairs and a flickering television mounted in the corner. As soon as the nurse left the room and closed the door, Jasmine threw her designer handbag onto an empty chair and crossed her arms. Her face was twisted in a mask of absolute denial. "This is a joke," she scoffed, pacing back and forth across the cheap linoleum floor. "This is a massive, embarrassing joke. Did you see the look on her face, Trent? She is so desperate for our attention that she actually hired people to pretend she is important. She probably bought that lab coat online just to embarrass us in front of those paramedics. I bet you can buy one with custom gold embroidery on Amazon for $50. My mother, Patricia, sank heavily into one of the chairs, clutching her purse to her chest. She looked pale and exhausted, but her pride refused to accept reality. "Jasmine is right," she muttered, shaking her head. "Chloe has always been prone to dramatics. Remember when she was a teenager and threatened to move out if I did not let her study science instead of law? She has always wanted to play the victim and make me look like a bad mother. But Chief of Neurosurgery, please. She is a college dropout who answers phones. She must have slept with someone in administration to get them to play along with this ridiculous stunt." While my mother and sister fed each other's delusions, Trent was completely silent. For a man who usually commanded every room he entered, he was suddenly acting like a cornered animal. He stood by the small window staring blankly at the parking lot below. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He loosened his expensive silk tie and unbuttoned the top of his collar, pulling at it as if he were choking. A thick layer of sweat had formed on his forehead, shining under the bright overhead lights. "Trent, honey, what is wrong?" Jasmine asked, stepping toward him and placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. Do not let Chloe upset you. You said you were going to call the hospital administrator and get her fired. You should do it right now. Call them and tell them she is impersonating a doctor. Trent violently slapped her hand away. His sudden aggression made Jasmine jump backward in shock. Shut up, Jasmine, he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fear and suppressed rage. Just shut up for 1 single minute and let me think. Jasmine gasped, her eyes widening. Excuse me, she demanded, putting her hands on her hips. Do not speak to me like that. My mother stood up, her maternal instincts kicking in to defend her golden child. Trent, there is no need to take your frustration out on your wife, she scolded gently. We are all stressed about Sarah, but Chloe is the one to blame here. You two are complete idiots! Trent exploded, turning to face them. His perfectly groomed facade was entirely shattered. Look at his face, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger toward the hallway. Did you not see the way those doctors looked at her? Did you not see the way that head nurse handed her that coat? That was not a prank. That was not a stunt. She is actually the chief of neurosurgery at this hospital. Jasmine rolled her eyes, refusing to let go of her narrative. You are being paranoid, Trent. Chloe is a nobody. She is not a nobody, Trent screamed, pacing the room like a maniac. Do you have any idea what hospital we are standing in right now? Memorial Hospital is the largest buyer of medical equipment in the entire state. My company has been negotiating a $15 million exclusive contract to supply their surgical wings with our new spinal implants. We have been working on this deal for 8 months. My entire career depends on it. So what? Jasmine asked, crossing her arms defensively. You are the director of sales. Just close the deal. What does Chloe have to do with your implants? Trent grabbed the back of a vinyl chair, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. Because the board of directors does not sign off on any surgical equipment without the final approval of the department heads, he practically sobbed. The final signature, the only signature that matters for this $15 million contract, belongs to the chief of neurosurgery. I have a meeting scheduled next week to present the final pitch to the department head. A department head whose name I did not know because they just took over the position 2 months ago. My mother's jaw dropped, the reality of the situation finally piercing through her stubborn ignorance. You mean to tell me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You mean Chloe has to approve your contract? Trent nodded, frantically wiping the sweat from his face with the back of his hand. Yes, Patricia. Chloe holds the entire deal in her hands. If she vetoes my implants, the contract dies. If the contract dies, I do not get my year-end commission bonus. Jasmine scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. So what if we do not get a bonus this year, Trent? We have plenty of money. We can just skip the summer trip to Europe and wait for the next deal. You are overreacting. Trent let out a hollow, desperate laugh that sounded almost manic. He looked at Jasmine with a mixture of disgust and sheer terror. You really do not get it, do you, Jasmine? He said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We do not have plenty of money. We are broke. We are worse than broke. What are you talking about? My mother demanded, taking a step forward. Trent, you make $500,000 a year. You just bought Jasmine a new Porsche. You live in a $2 million house. I bought that Porsche with company funds, Trent confessed, the words spilling out of him like poison. I have been skimming money from the corporate expense accounts for the last 3 years to pay for her designer clothes, her luxury vacations, and the mortgage on that massive house. I am in a mountain of debt. My boss has been asking questions about the missing funds. I told him the $15 million Memorial Hospital contract would cover everything and that the hospital was going to pay a massive upfront retainer. Jasmine backed away from him, hitting the wall. Her face went entirely pale. You embezzled money from your company, she whispered in horror. I did it to keep you happy, you spoiled brat, Trent shouted at her. You never stop spending. You never look at a price tag. If I do not close this deal with Memorial Hospital next week, the corporate accountants are going to run a full audit on my department. When they see the missing funds, I am not just going to get fired. I am going to be investigated by the federal government. I will go to federal prison for a decade. The waiting room plunged into a suffocating silence. The television flickered in the corner, playing a cheerful commercial that felt entirely out of place. My mother slumped back into her chair, clutching her chest as if she were the one having a heart attack. Jasmine covered her mouth with her hands, tears finally welling up in her eyes, not out of concern for my aunt, but out of fear for her own lavish lifestyle. Trent stood in the center of the room, trembling as the full weight of his reality crashed down upon him. The dark-skinned woman he had just publicly humiliated, the sister-in-law he had just offered a $50 tip to fetch his car, was now the only person standing between him and a federal penitentiary. I was holding the scalpel that could save my aunt's life, but I was also holding the blade that could completely sever his. 2 hours later, I stepped out of the operating room and pulled off my surgical cap. The heavy double doors swung shut behind me as I walked down the quiet hallway toward the family waiting area. I was exhausted, but the surgery was a complete success. We had managed to relieve the pressure on my aunt's brain just in time. When I pushed open the door to the waiting room, all three of them jumped in their seats. Trent looked like he was about to faint. Jasmine was chewing on her perfectly manicured fingernails with a look of utter panic. My mother stood up immediately, smoothing her skirt. I looked at her, expecting a mother to ask about her sister's critical condition. Instead, her eyes darted to the gold lettering on my white coat. The reality of my powerful position had clearly set in while I was busy saving a life in the operating room. "Sarah is stable," I said, breaking the tense, suffocating silence. "The aneurysm was severe, but we caught it early enough. She will need to stay in the intensive care unit for a few days to monitor her brain activity, but she is going to make a full recovery. You can see her one at a time in about an hour." My mother nodded, waving off the news about her own sister, as if I had just given her the weather forecast. "Well, that is good," she said briskly, taking a step toward me. "But we have much more pressing matters to discuss right now, Chloe. Trent explained everything to us while you were in surgery. He told us all about the new medical equipment contract his company is trying to close with your hospital. He says you are the department head who has to sign off on the final procurement paperwork." She looked at me with an expectation that made my stomach turn. "This is wonderful news, Chloe. You are finally in a position to actually help this family. Trent needs this contract approved by next week so he can secure his year-end bonus. Jasmine is looking at buying a vacation home in Aspen, and they desperately need that money to close the deal. You need to go into your office tomorrow morning and sign whatever forms Trent gives you." I stared at my mother, letting her demands hang in the sterile air of the waiting room. My aunt was barely out of brain surgery, and my mother was already trying to leverage my medical license to fund my sister's luxury vacations. "I am not signing anything," I replied calmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "I do not do favors when it comes to patient safety and hospital equipment." My mother's face hardened into a mask of pure indignation. "Do not be selfish, Chloe," she snapped, taking another step toward me. "You owe this family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us for everything we sacrificed so you could be where you are right now. Jasmine needs her husband to get this bonus. You are her sister, and it is your duty to help her succeed." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the bare walls of the room. "Owe you?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You think I owe this family something? Like how you borrowed the $20,000 Grandpa Theodore left me in his will for my medical school tuition. You stole my inheritance and used it to pay for Jasmine's destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas because you said she deserved a perfect day. You cut me off without a penny when I refused to go to law school, and I worked 3 jobs just to pay for my medical textbooks. I ate ramen noodles in a freezing apartment while you bought Jasmine designer bags. I owe you absolutely nothing." My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace in mock horror. "That money was for the family," she stuttered, trying to justify her theft. "And now you have plenty of money. You are just being vindictive because Trent made a little joke at dinner." Trent finally found his voice. He stepped out from the corner of the room, trying to paste his arrogant corporate smile back onto his sweating, pale face. "Come on, Chloe," he said, holding his trembling hands up defensively. "Let us not let silly family drama get in the way of good business. I apologize for the misunderstanding at the restaurant. You proved your point. You are the big boss here. I respect that. Now let us talk as professionals. My company is offering state-of-the-art spinal implants. It is a $15 million deal that will make you look smart to the hospital board. Just sign the final approval and we can all walk away happy and wealthy. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a silver pen, offering it to me as if I were one of his gullible clients. I looked at the pen and then looked Trent dead in the eye. You really think this is about a petty grudge from dinner, Trent? I asked, stepping closer to him until he was forced to look down at me. I do not care about your little jokes. I care about my patients. I reviewed your company's spinal implants 3 days ago when the procurement file crossed my desk. I read the independent trial reports that your executives tried to bury. The titanium threading on your implants degrades after 6 months, causing severe tissue damage and spinal fluid leaks. They are completely defective. Trent dropped the pen. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp clatter. I took a step back and delivered the final blow. I already submitted my evaluation to the hospital board this morning, I said coldly. I officially vetoed your $15 million contract. You are never selling those dangerous implants to Memorial Hospital. The next morning when I arrived at my VIP executive office at Memorial Hospital, my peace was abruptly shattered. My sanctuary usually offered a commanding view of the medical campus, but today it felt like a cage. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat behind my heavy oak desk ready to prepare for my morning surgical rounds. The heavy glass door to my suite swung open without a knock. Trent stepped inside, aggressively pushing past my protesting administrative assistant. He quickly shut the door behind him and locked it with a sharp click. He had traded his usual arrogant swagger for a calculated and predatory stillness. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night, but his tailored suit was immaculately pressed. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase. My assistant buzzed my intercom, her voice trembling as she apologized and asked if she should call hospital security. I pressed the button on my desk console and told her it was fine, instructing her to hold my calls. I leaned back in my leather chair and took a slow sip of my coffee, refusing to show him even an ounce of intimidation. Trent walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug and planted his hands firmly on the edge of my desk. He dropped his loud barking tone. Instead, he adopted a low, dangerously smooth voice. It was the voice of a white corporate executive used to manipulating his way out of trouble. "Look, Chloe," he began, forcing a tight, patronizing smile. "You had your fun last night. You put on a great show for your mother and your sister. You proved you are the big boss of this hospital. I give you credit for that. You have done incredibly well for yourself, especially considering where you started and the obvious disadvantages people like you face in this industry." I did not flinch at his racially coded insult. He was trying to remind me of my place, trying to subtly imply that my success was a fluke or a diversity quota, rather than the result of 14 years of grueling medical training. "But you need to understand something," he continued, his tone turning dark and serious. "Practicing medicine is one thing, but you do not understand the complexities of high-stakes corporate politics. You are playing a dangerous game with money you cannot even begin to comprehend. My company is backed by massive private equity firms. These are ruthless billionaires, Chloe. If you officially block this $15 million contract, you are not just hurting me, you are declaring war on my investors." I set my coffee mug down on the wooden desk with a soft thud. "And what exactly will your billionaire investors do to me, Trent?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Trent stood up straight and crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with false bravado. "They will destroy you," he threatened coldly. "They will launch a massive public relations smear campaign against Memorial Hospital. They will scrutinize every single surgery you have ever performed, looking for one tiny mistake to leak to the press. They will fund lawsuits from disgruntled patients. They will make sure the medical board investigates your credentials until you are stripped of your title and forced to resign in absolute disgrace. You will go from chief of neurosurgery back to being a nobody overnight. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to log into the procurement portal right now. You are going to retract your veto, and you are going to digitally sign the final approval for my spinal implants. If you do that, I will personally guarantee that a substantial consulting fee finds its way into an offshore account in your name. Everyone wins. Your hospital gets the equipment. I get my year-end bonus to pay off my massive debts, and you get a comfortable financial safety net. Just sign the contract, Chloe. Do not be stubborn and ruin your own career over a petty family disagreement. I listened to his entire speech without interrupting. When he finally finished his desperate monologue, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I did not pull out a pen to sign his fraudulent contract. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder and dropped it squarely in the center of my desk. I reached over and flipped it open. Let me tell you what I actually understand about corporate politics, Trent, I said smoothly. I understand that a desperate man drowning in secret debt will say anything to save himself. Jasmine told me you buy her silence with luxury cars. But I do not care about your financial ruin. I care about the bodies you leave behind to fund it. I slid a glossy 8x10 photograph across the desk toward him. It was an X-ray image of a shattered human spine. I know about your secret debt, Trent, but more importantly, I know about the federal investigation. You see, the medical community is very small. I made a few phone calls to my colleagues in Ohio this morning. I pulled the investigative file on your new spinal implants. 2 patients, Trent. 2 innocent patients in Cleveland were paralyzed from the waist down last month because the titanium threading on your exact model snapped under standard weight-bearing pressure. Your company is currently spending millions to quietly settle the lawsuits and bury the evidence before the government issues a mandatory recall. Trent stared at the photograph of the shattered spine. All the arrogant color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His perfectly manicured hands began to shake uncontrollably against his sides. Suddenly, he was no longer the powerful corporate executive trying to intimidate a woman of color. He was a cornered rat who had just realized the trap was completely shut. Trent backed away from my desk, his eyes wide with terror. He turned around, unlocked the glass door, and practically ran out of my office. I watched him leave feeling no pity, only a cold determination to protect my hospital and my patients. 2 days passed without any further incidents. Aunt Sarah was recovering beautifully in the intensive care unit, and my surgical schedule kept me busy. I thought the family drama was finally over. I was completely wrong. On Sunday morning, my phone rang while I was reviewing patient charts. It was Pastor Miller, the head of the church my mother attended for decades. He had a deep, soothing voice and a reputation for mediating community disputes. He told me he was hosting a special dinner at my mother's house to pray for Aunt Sarah's healing. He asked me to be there, saying the family desperately needed spiritual unity. Out of deep respect for the pastor and his church, I reluctantly agreed to attend. When I arrived at the familiar brick colonial house, the smell of pot roast and collard greens filled the air. It felt like a trap the moment I walked through the front door. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest china, but there was absolutely no atmosphere of prayer or gratitude. Pastor Miller sat at the head of the table looking incredibly uncomfortable in his dark suit. My mother Patricia and my sister Jasmine sat on either side of him, dabbing their eyes with tissue paper, playing the roles of distressed victims perfectly. Trent was noticeably absent, likely hiding from his mounting failures. I took a seat at the far end of the table, folding my hands politely in my lap, and waited for the performance to begin. We did not even make it through the opening prayer before the true purpose of this dinner was finally revealed. My mother looked at the pastor and let out a loud sob that echoed in the dining room. "Pastor Miller!" she cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Please talk some sense into her. We are a good Christian family, but Chloe has let her worldly success turn her heart into stone. She is maliciously trying to destroy my son-in-law's career out of pure spite." The pastor looked at me with a heavy sigh, carefully adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He gently told me that holding grudges was a heavy spiritual burden, and that I should not use my new position at the hospital to unfairly punish my family members for past misunderstandings. I realized instantly that my mother and sister had spent the entire afternoon filling his head with vicious, manipulative lies. Before I could calmly explain the undeniable truth about the defective medical equipment, Jasmine slammed her hand onto the table. She glared at me with pure hatred, her makeup running down her cheeks. "You are just horribly jealous of me, Chloe," she screamed, her voice echoing off the dining room walls. "You have always been jealous of me. Trent is a good man. He is a wonderful provider who takes care of his family. He works hard to give me a beautiful life. You are just bitter because you are 34 years old and completely single. You sit all alone in your big office while I have a husband who loves me enough to buy me a brand new luxury Porsche. You want to ruin my marriage because nobody wants to marry you." I looked at my sister, listening to her scream about a man who was actively pushing defective surgical implants into the spines of innocent people just to fund her shallow lifestyle. I did not feel angry. I felt a genuine wave of amusement wash over me. I let out a loud, sharp laugh that caught them off guard. The sound of my laughter silenced Jasmine's screaming immediately. "He bought you a Porsche?" I asked, looking directly into Jasmine's panicked eyes. "Is that what Trent told you, Jasmine? Because that is a fascinating lie. The auto dealership called my private cell phone by mistake last Wednesday. They were trying to verify some financial details and thought I was the primary contact because my hospital number was listed on the emergency reference sheet. They sent over the financing paperwork to my email before I could correct their mistake. Trent did not buy you that car, Jasmine. He financed that $100,000 Porsche under Mother's name, using her forged signature." The dining room went silent. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Jasmine stopped crying, her mouth hanging open in shock. She looked at my mother, who had turned the color of ash. Patricia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about?" My mother whispered, her voice shaking with pure terror. "That is impossible." Pastor Miller stood up, pushing his chair back from the table with a scrape. His face was stern and filled with a deep disgust. "I came here today to pray for a family in pain," he said, his voice booming with authority. "I did not come here to be used as a pawn in a web of financial lies and deceit." Without another word, the pastor turned around and quickly walked out the front door, leaving his untouched dinner behind. Even with the pastor gone, my mother shook her head back and forth, refusing to accept reality. "You are a liar, Chloe," she yelled, her voice desperate and thin. "Trent has an honest face. He is a good white man from a respectable family. He would never steal from me." I stood up from the table, smoothing my coat. "Believe whatever you want, Mother," I replied quietly. "But when the bank comes knocking, do not say I did not warn you." I walked slowly out of the house, leaving them behind to drown in their own stubborn denial. I drove away from my mother's house that Sunday evening, feeling a strange sense of finality. The burden of seeking their approval had lifted from my shoulders. I knew Trent would not accept his defeat. Cornered animals are always dangerous before they are caught. He had everything to lose, and his massive ego would never allow a dark-skinned woman to dictate his downfall. I spent Monday performing complex spinal surgeries, focusing entirely on the fragile vertebrae of my patients, pushing my family out of my mind. But early Tuesday morning, the inevitable counterattack arrived. I was in my office reviewing post-operative scans when my secure phone rang. It was Dr. Elias Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Memorial Hospital. His voice was unusually tight and formal. He asked me to come down to the main executive boardroom immediately. He told me it was an emergency meeting regarding a severe human resources complaint filed against me by an external corporate vendor. I hung up the phone, taking a deep breath. Trent had made his move. He had weaponized his corporate legal team to launch a full-scale smear campaign against my character. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the executive wing, my white coat flapping slightly behind me. I did not feel fear. I only felt a cold, calculating readiness. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, the tension in the air was thick. The entire hospital board of directors was seated around the massive mahogany table. Dr. Sterling sat at the head of the table looking deeply concerned, but it was the people seated on the opposite side of the room that truly set the stage. Trent was leaning back in a plush leather chair, looking like he owned the building. He wore a dark navy bespoke suit with a silk pocket square, his blonde hair perfectly styled. He looked completely relaxed, radiating an aura of untouchable privilege. Sitting beside him were three men in expensive gray suits. They were his corporate attorneys, armed with thick leather binders and aggressive scowls. Trent caught my eye as I walked into the room, and a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He actually believed he had won. He believed his expensive lawyers and slick corporate charm could easily overpower my 14 years of flawless medical service. I took the empty seat opposite him, folding my hands neatly on the polished wood surface. Dr. Sterling cleared his throat, opening a thick file folder. "Dr. Chloe," he began, his tone heavy with regret. "We received a highly disturbing formal complaint from Sterling Medical Devices. Their legal team filed an official grievance claiming you attempted to extort their director of sales during a private meeting in your office. They are alleging that you explicitly demanded a personal bribe of $500,000 in exchange for your signature on the $15 million spinal implant contract. They claim that when Mr. Trent refused to pay this extortion fee, you vindictively vetoed the hospital contract out of spite." One of Trent's lawyers, a man with a sharp nose and cold eyes, leaned forward, opening his binder. "We have submitted a sworn affidavit from our client," he stated smoothly. "We also understand there is a personal family history here, making this abuse of power even more egregious. Dr. Chloe is using her newly acquired position to settle petty family grievances while simultaneously trying to line her own pockets. This is a severe violation of medical ethics and federal contracting laws. We demand her immediate termination and a full reversal of the contract veto. If the board does not comply, we are prepared to file a massive defamation and breach of contract lawsuit against Memorial Hospital that will ruin this institution's pristine reputation." Trent sat back and steepled his fingers, resting his chin on his hands. He looked at me with a sickening expression of fake sympathy, playing the victimized honest businessman perfectly. "It truly pains me to do this, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I wanted to keep this strictly in the family. I tried to reason with you, but you left me no choice. You cannot use the hospital as your personal piggy bank. You need to take responsibility for your unethical actions." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring quietly. Dr. Sterling looked at me, his eyes silently pleading for a reasonable explanation. They were terrified of the lawsuit. Trent's white privilege and corporate backing cast a massive shadow over the room. But I did not panic or loudly defend my innocence. I simply smiled at him. I looked directly at Trent and let out a soft, chilling laugh. "You really went all out, Trent," I said calmly. "The expensive lawyers, the sworn affidavits. It is a beautiful performance, but you made one truly critical miscalculation. You assumed I was playing the same petty corporate game as you." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my hospital pager, placing it on the table. "Dr. Sterling," I said, shifting my gaze to the CEO. "Before we address these ridiculous extortion claims, I would like to introduce the board to a special guest I invited to this meeting. I felt we needed an objective third party to review the validity of Trent's spinal implants." I pressed a hidden button under the boardroom table. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark windbreaker walked into the room holding a thick stack of files. He pulled out a gold badge and placed it firmly on the table right in front of Trent's expensive lawyers. "Good morning, everyone," the man said, his voice deep and commanding. "I am Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in medical fraud and corporate embezzlement. Dr. Chloe invited me here today to discuss a criminal investigation that is currently expanding into this very room." Trent's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of complete, sheer, unadulterated horror. The room fell into a stunned silence as Special Agent Vance walked over to the mahogany table and unclipped his thick folder. The lead attorney, who had just aggressively demanded my termination, immediately closed his leather binder and leaned away from Trent as if my brother-in-law had caught a highly contagious disease. Agent Vance did not sit down. He stood tall, casting a long shadow over the boardroom, and began passing out copies of printed documents to every single hospital board member. "What you are holding in your hands are internal company emails," Agent Vance stated, his voice projecting clear, absolute authority. "These were subpoenaed this morning from corporate servers. They detail a deliberate, systematic cover-up orchestrated by Mr. Trent regarding the catastrophic failure rate of his titanium spinal implants. Furthermore, these emails explicitly document his repeated efforts to embezzle company funds to cover massive personal debts." Agent Vance turned his piercing gaze directly onto Trent. "We have been investigating your division for 3 weeks. Your desperate attempt to push this defective hardware onto Memorial Hospital to secure a massive commission check was the final piece of evidence we needed. You were not extorted by Dr. Chloe. You were trying to use her hospital as a dumping ground for dangerous medical waste to save yourself from bankruptcy." Trent jumped out of his plush leather chair, his face turning a dark, violent shade of crimson. "This is an absolute outrage," he screamed, slamming his fist onto the polished wood table. "This is a coordinated witch hunt. You cannot just barge into a private corporate meeting with fake printed emails." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wild with desperate fury. "She set me up. This is reverse racism. This is blatant discrimination against a successful white businessman because she cannot stand that I provide a better life for her sister than she ever could. I am going to sue this entire hospital. I will sue the board of directors. I will sue the federal government. I will tie all of you up in endless litigation for the next 20 years until this hospital is reduced to rubble." His screaming echoed off the boardroom walls, but it did not have the intimidating effect he desired. Instead, the board members looked at him with sheer disgust. His own lawyers were frantically whispering to each other, completely abandoning his defense. One of the attorneys stood up and loudly declared that their law firm was officially withdrawing, as Trent's legal counsel, effective immediately, citing a severe conflict of interest and undisclosed criminal liabilities. Trent looked at his retreating lawyers in pure shock, but he still refused to surrender his pride. He turned back to Dr. Sterling, breathing heavily. "You cannot believe this nonsense," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the pressure. "She is lying. There is absolutely no proof that I ever threatened her or knew about any defective implants. It is her word against mine, and I have a spotless corporate record." I sat completely still, allowing him to dig his grave as deep as possible. When he finally stopped yelling, I reached across the table and picked up my cell phone. "Actually, Trent, there is absolute proof," I said smoothly. "You see, when you ambushed me in my office yesterday morning, you were so blinded by your own arrogance that you forgot one very simple detail. You called my secure hospital line 10 minutes before you barged in, and you left a highly descriptive voicemail when I did not answer." I unlocked my phone, opened the voicemail app, and pressed play. I turned the volume all the way up and set the device in the center of the mahogany table. The audio was crystal clear. Trent's voice filled the silent boardroom, dripping with malice and entitlement. "Listen to me, Chloe." The recorded voice began echoing loudly. "I am coming up to your office right now, and you are going to sign that contract. I do not care what those safety reports from Ohio say. So what if the titanium threading snaps? Those implants are good enough for the poor, uninsured patients your hospital takes in from the city. They should be grateful they are getting any surgery at all. You sign the paper, or I will completely destroy your career and make sure you never practice medicine again." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Dr. Sterling looked physically sick. The board members stared at Trent with unvarnished horror. The idea that a medical sales director would intentionally push defective hardware onto vulnerable, low-income patients was a violation so deep it defied basic human decency. Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked around the room searching for a single sympathetic face, but found only cold, hard rejection. Dr. Sterling stood up, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. Security, he called out, pressing a button on his desk console. Two large hospital security guards immediately entered the boardroom. "Escort this man out of my hospital," Dr. Sterling ordered, pointing a firm finger at Trent. "And if he ever sets foot on Memorial Campus again, have him arrested for criminal trespassing." The security guard stepped forward and grabbed Trent by his arms, physically lifting him out of his chair. He did not fight back. The fight had completely left him. He was marched out of the boardroom and down the long, carpeted hallway. I walked calmly behind them, wanting to witness the exact moment his fragile empire completely collapsed. The guards escorted him directly into the main hospital lobby. Trent's entire regional sales team was waiting near the reception desk, holding their briefcases and coffee cups, expecting him to emerge with a signed $15 million contract. Instead, they watched in stunned silence as their arrogant boss was marched past them by security, looking pale and entirely broken. Just as Trent reached the sliding glass doors, his cell phone rang violently in his pocket. He struggled to answer it, pulling it out with shaking hands. It was the chief executive officer of Sterling Medical Devices. Agent Vance had just raided their corporate headquarters. Trent listened for exactly 3 seconds before dropping the phone onto the tile floor. He was fired, immediately stripped of his title, his salary, and his company car. The glass doors slid open, and Trent was shoved out into the harsh morning sunlight with absolutely nothing left to his name. News of Trent's spectacular downfall spread through the medical community with the speed of a wildfire. By noon, his name had been scrubbed from his company's corporate directory, and his federal indictment was looming. I returned to my surgical rounds feeling a profound sense of relief. The hospital was safe from his defective implants, and my conscience was clear. But while Trent was busy making desperate phone calls to criminal defense attorneys who demanded massive retainers, his wife was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic collapse of her fake empire. Jasmine had spent her morning doing exactly what she always did. She went shopping to soothe her bruised ego. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Jasmine was standing at the VIP checkout counter of a high-end designer boutique in the city center. She had piled 3 leather handbags, a pair of diamond stud earrings, and several silk scarves onto the glass counter. The total was nearly $30,000. She confidently handed the sales associate her platinum credit card, completely expecting the usual fawning treatment. Instead, the associate swiped the card, frowned, and swiped it again. The machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red declined message on the small screen. Jasmine let out an annoyed sigh, blaming the machine, and pulled out a different card. This one was a Black Elite Rewards card, linked directly to Trent's corporate expense account. The associate swiped it. Declined. Jasmine began to sweat. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out every piece of plastic she owned, throwing them onto the counter in a desperate frenzy. Card after card was swiped, and every single one was rejected. The sales associate gave her a look of polite pity that Jasmine found absolutely infuriating. Humiliated and furious, Jasmine grabbed her phone, quickly calling her husband. It went straight to voicemail. She called the bank, and after 20 minutes on hold, a customer service representative coldly informed her that all of her accounts had been frozen by federal order due to a pending criminal investigation. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The money was gone. The prestige was gone. The illusion was completely shattered. Instead of going home to find her husband, Jasmine directed her blind rage at the only person she had ever been allowed to blame for her problems. She drove her unpaid Porsche straight to Memorial Hospital today. She did not bother going to the visitor desk. She bypassed the security checkpoint and stormed directly into the crowded main lobby of the emergency wing. The space was filled with patients waiting for care, families holding quietly onto hope, and exhausted nurses moving between triage stations. I was standing near the central nurses' station, reviewing a post-operative chart with a resident, when the sliding glass doors burst open. Jasmine marched into the lobby, looking like a deranged hurricane. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her expensive makeup was smudged, and her face was a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She spotted me instantly. "Chloe," she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet hum of the hospital lobby. Every head in the room turned toward her. I handed the medical chart back to the resident and stepped forward, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I was not going to let her turn my hospital into her personal reality television show. "Jasmine, keep your voice down," I said firmly, keeping my distance. "This is a hospital lobby. There are sick people here. If you want to speak to me, we can go into a private conference room down the long hallway now." "I am not going anywhere with you," she shrieked, planting her feet firmly on the tile floor. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You ruined my life, you malicious, vindictive monster. You set Trent up with the FBI because you are jealous of my perfect marriage. They froze my bank accounts. They took my credit cards. I could not even buy a cup of coffee this morning because of your petty little revenge plot." Murmurs broke out among the waiting patients. Two hospital security guards began to slowly approach from the rear corridors, observing the rapidly escalating situation. "Trent ruined his own life, Jasmine," I replied, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze water. "He embezzled millions of dollars from his company and tried to sell dangerous surgical equipment to this hospital. He is a criminal. You should be angry at him for lying to you. He is a provider." Jasmine screamed, stomping her foot like a spoiled toddler. "He was doing what he had to do to take care of his family. You have absolutely no idea how much pressure he was under to keep up our lavish lifestyle. And now his lawyers are demanding money. They want a $50,000 retainer just to keep him out of federal prison." She sobbed wildly, taking a step closer to me, with her eyes wild and desperate. "You are going to pay it, Chloe. You have millions of dollars. You are hoarding wealth, sitting in your fancy executive office, while your own flesh and blood suffers. You are going to write me a check for $50,000 right now, or I will stand in this lobby and scream until the press shows up. You owe me this money right now. You owe this family everything today." I looked at my older sister standing there completely unhinged. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life belittling me, treating me like a complete failure, and laughing while her husband humiliated me at a dinner table. I felt absolutely nothing for her. Not pity, not anger, just a deep, hollow indifference. I raised my hand, making a brief, sharp gesture toward the two security guards standing nearby. They immediately stepped forward, flanking Jasmine on both sides. Jasmine looked at them, gasping in shock. "I am not your ATM, Jasmine," I stated coldly. "Go ask your provider." Jasmine did not go back to her empty home. She drove straight to our mother's large house, crying hysterically about her completely frozen bank accounts. My mother, Patricia, was incapable of processing the reality of a criminal son-in-law. To her, the most important thing was her pristine reputation among the congregation at Grace Fellowship Church. The thought of church ladies whispering about bankruptcy was a fate worse than death. She decided she would fix the situation herself. She would go to the bank and take out a second mortgage on her home. She reasoned a cash injection would pay Trent's legal retainers, unfreeze the accounts, and keep their fake image intact until this blew over. The next morning, Patricia dressed in her finest tailored suit and marched into the lobby of First National Bank. She walked directly to the desk of the branch manager, Mr. Hastings, demanding immediate service as a loyal account holder of 30 years. She sat in his leather chair, crossed her legs, and requested a $200,000 cash loan against the equity of her home. She smiled confidently, expecting the manager to print the approval paperwork. Instead, Mr. Hastings typed her information into his computer, and a deep frown creased his forehead. He adjusted his glasses and looked at his screen for a long minute. The silence stretched on until my mother impatiently tapped her nails on the desk. "Is there a problem, Mr. Hastings?" My mother asked, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "I have owned that property for decades. There should be more than enough equity for a small loan." Mr. Hastings took a slow, deep breath and turned his monitor toward her. "Mrs. Patricia," he began, his voice filled with professional detachment. "I am afraid there is a severe problem. You do not have any equity left in your home. In fact, your property is currently underwater. According to our records, you took out a massive secondary home equity line of credit 3 years ago, and it is entirely maxed out. You also have 2 luxury vehicles heavily financed using this property as collateral. Your total debt far exceeds the current market value of your home. I cannot lend you a single penny." My mother froze, looking incredibly rigid and pale. "That is completely impossible," she gasped, dropping her voice to a panicked whisper. "I never authorized a second mortgage. I paid off my house 10 years ago. I only drive a sensible sedan. There must be a catastrophic mistake in your system." Mr. Hastings shook his head, sliding a stack of signed documents across the desk. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Patricia. The loans were authorized online. The signatures match your file perfectly. All funds were transferred directly into a joint business account managed by your son-in-law, Trent Sterling." My mother stared at the documents. The signatures were perfect forgeries. The reality of Trent's betrayal crashed down upon her, destroying decades of carefully curated respectability. She was entirely broke, and her beloved son-in-law was the architect of her ruin. She stood up so fast, her chair hit the glass wall. She quickly grabbed her designer purse and practically ran out of the bank, gasping for fresh air as she fled to her car. She drove recklessly across town, straight to the McMansion that Trent and Jasmine rented in the wealthy suburbs. She pounded her fists on the front door until Trent yanked it open. He looked terrible, wearing sweatpants and holding a half-empty glass of whiskey. "You stole from me," my mother screamed, pushing past him into the foyer. "You forged my name on bank documents. You secretly mortgaged my home to pay for your fraudulent lifestyle. You are a thief." Trent slammed the front door shut, his eyes burning with a drunken, arrogant rage. He did not apologize. He did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, the thin veneer of his polite corporate racism evaporated. He threw his whiskey glass against the marble floor, shattering it. "Do not you dare come into my house and yell at me," he roared, stepping aggressively toward her. "I only had to forge your signature because you people always expect me to foot the bill for your country club memberships. You and your spoiled daughter expected me to be the wealthy white savior who elevated your social status. You wanted the fancy cars and the perfect church image, but none of you wanted to work for it. You bled me dry, Patricia. You expected me to provide a lifestyle that was financially impossible, and now you call me a thief. I am not a thief. I am the only reason you got to play rich for the last 5 years." My mother backed away from him, trembling violently. The blatant racial undertones of his screaming attack stripped away the last delusion she held about his character. He had never respected her. He had only viewed her family as a heavy burden that he resented carrying. "You are a monster," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "Get out of my house," Trent snarled, pointing a shaking finger at the door. My mother drove back to her colonial home in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. When she pulled into her driveway, she saw a stranger in a dark suit standing on her porch. He was holding a large manila envelope and a clipboard. She stepped out of her car, her legs feeling like heavy lead. The man walked down the steps and handed her the envelope, asking her to confirm her name. When she nodded, he handed her a pen to sign the delivery receipt. She opened the envelope right there on the lawn. It was an official legal summons from the First National Bank. Because Trent missed the last 4 payments on the forged loans, the bank was officially issuing a final notice of foreclosure on her home. The heavy legal summons slipped from my mother's trembling fingers and landed softly in the damp grass of her manicured lawn. She stood on her front walkway, staring down at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The brutal reality of losing her home, the ultimate and final symbol of her carefully constructed social status, was simply too much for her fragile mind to process all at once. She left the foreclosure papers sitting right there in the yard, got back into her sensible sedan, and drove aimlessly around the city for nearly an hour before her autopilot directed her toward Memorial Hospital. She was desperately seeking the only person who had ever consistently anchored her through past family crises. She needed to see her older sister Sarah to find some twisted form of comfort. At that exact moment, I was standing quietly inside the intensive care unit. The rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the cardiac monitor provided a steady, comforting soundtrack to the sterile room. Aunt Sarah was finally fully awake. The invasive breathing tube had been removed earlier that morning, and although she looked incredibly frail and small against the stark white hospital sheets, her eyes were remarkably sharp and lucid. I was checking her neurological responses carefully, shining a small penlight into her pupils to measure her reactivity when the heavy glass door of the room slid open. My mother walked in looking like a hollow, shattered shell of the arrogant woman she had been just a few days prior. Her expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled, and her pristine makeup was completely washed away by hours of crying. However, even in the face of her absolute financial ruin, my mother could not easily abandon her deeply ingrained habit of toxic manipulation. Seeing me standing over Sarah's hospital bed instantly reignited her bitter need to assign blame to anyone but herself. She rushed straight to the bedside, grabbing Sarah's frail hand with both of hers, and began to cry loudly. "Oh, Sarah," she wailed deliberately, ignoring my medical authority in the room. "Thank goodness you are finally awake and alive. This family is falling apart completely, and I am so alone. You have absolutely no idea the terrifying nightmare we are living through right now. Chloe has completely destroyed us all. She got Trent fired from his executive job out of pure spite, and now the bank is threatening to take my house away. All of this terrible, unnecessary stress is exactly why you collapsed at the restaurant." If Chloe had just learned her place and signed that simple medical contract, none of this tragedy would have ever happened. I stepped back from the bed, folding my arms firmly across my chest. I was entirely prepared to summon a security guard and have my mother escorted out of the intensive care unit for raising her voice and disturbing a critical trauma patient. But before I could speak, Aunt Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and let out a weak, raspy groan that silenced the room. "Patricia," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the medical machines. "Stop it. Just stop talking right now." My mother froze, her face twisted in a ridiculous mask of confused victimhood. "What do you mean, Sarah?" she asked defensively, wiping her nose. "I am just telling you the honest truth about how your niece's awful behavior caused your terrible stroke." Aunt Sarah slowly turned her head on the soft pillow, fixing my mother with a look of profound exhaustion and deep sorrow. "Chloe did not cause my stroke, Patricia," my aunt said, her words incredibly slow, but dripping with absolute certainty. "Trent did." The room went completely silent. I took a step closer to the bed, my medical instincts instantly replaced by a sudden chilling realization that there was a massive dark piece of the puzzle I was missing. My mother blinked rapidly, shaking her head in denial. "Trent," she echoed, sounding entirely bewildered. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" "Trent was sitting right next to me at the dinner table when you collapsed. He was perfectly fine. He even offered to give Chloe a generous $50 tip for the valet parking." Aunt Sarah let out a bitter, dry cough, clutching the edge of her thermal blanket. "He was not fine, Patricia. He was a desperate, terrifying monster." She took a slow, shaky breath, forcing herself to recount the horror she had kept hidden from us. "Before we walked into the steakhouse that night, I parked my car in the dark back overflow lot. Trent was waiting for me, hidden between the parked vehicles. He cornered me against my driver's side door before I could even grab my purse. He smelled like cheap whiskey and pure panic. He grabbed my shoulders so hard he left massive purple bruises. He pinned me against the cold metal and aggressively demanded that I liquidate my entire retirement account and transfer the funds to him immediately." My mother gasped violently, covering her mouth with her hands. "Why on earth would he want your retirement money?" she whispered in absolute horror. "Because he told me he owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to incredibly dangerous people." Aunt Sarah continued, tears finally spilling down her pale cheeks and soaking into the pillow. "He said loan sharks were threatening to break his legs if he did not pay them by the end of the month. I told him I would not give him a single penny of my hard-earned pension. He became violent Patricia. He slammed his heavy fist into my car window right next to my head and screamed that if I did not give him the money, he would make sure Jasmine and I suffered the physical consequences. The sheer terror of that moment, the physical intimidation from a man I thought was family, sent my blood pressure skyrocketing. My chest tightened, my vision went completely blurry, and by the time I walked into the restaurant, my brain was already bleeding. He caused this stroke, Patricia. Your perfect white son-in-law nearly killed me for cash. I stared at my aunt, feeling a heavy wave of pure disgust wash over me. Trent was not just a white-collar corporate criminal embezzling from a faceless company. He was a violent predator actively terrorizing the vulnerable women in his own family to save his own skin. I turned to look at my mother. Patricia stood frozen by the bed, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The ultimate illusion had finally been completely shattered. The wealthy, respectable son-in-law she worshipped, the man she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect, was nothing more than a violent, desperate thug who had driven her into bankruptcy and nearly murdered her sister. The heavy, suffocating weight of her own foolish choices crashed down upon her shoulders, and for the very first time in her life, my mother had absolutely no one else left to blame. While my mother was staring at the legal destruction of her life, Jasmine was dealing with a completely different nightmare inside her rented mansion. After violently kicking Patricia out, Trent had retreated to his dark mahogany home office. He locked the heavy double doors and proceeded to drown his federal criminal charges in a bottle of scotch he could no longer afford. Jasmine was sitting on the edge of her massive king-sized bed, feeling entirely numb. Her platinum credit cards were completely useless blocks of plastic, and the luxurious life she had built her entire identity around was crumbling into dust. She heard Trent snoring from the office downstairs. He had eventually passed out at his desk, his arrogant rage finally subdued by the heavy alcohol. Jasmine crept downstairs, her bare feet making no sound on the imported hardwood floors. She used a spare brass key to unlock the office door. She was not looking for a loud fight. She was desperately looking for cash. She thought Trent might have hidden some emergency funds in his desk drawer to help them survive the week. She carefully opened the heavy wooden door, wincing at the sharp smell of stale alcohol and nervous sweat that filled the stifling room. Trent was slumped over his leather desk chair, his face pressed against a scattered pile of unpaid utility bills and legal threats from his former corporate employer. Jasmine tiptoed around him and slowly opened the bottom right drawer of his desk, where he kept his travel documents and spare keys. There was no emergency cash hidden inside. Instead, her fingers brushed against a small, cheap piece of black plastic tucked beneath a stack of old business cards. It was a prepaid burner cell phone. Jasmine frowned, her heart suddenly pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Trent was a man who obsessed over the latest expensive technology. He mocked people who used outdated devices. There was no legitimate reason for a medical sales director to possess a cheap, untraceable burner phone. Her hands began to shake as she picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen glowed a harsh, bright white in the dim office, illuminating her terrified face. The phone was not locked with a passcode. Jasmine opened the messaging application and felt the remaining air violently sucked out of her lungs. The inbox was completely full of messages sent to a single unlisted number with a Miami area code. She clicked the conversation thread, and her eyes scanned the endless stream of texts and attached photographs. The recipient was a girl named Lexi. She looked barely 22 years old, posing in tiny bikinis on the deck of a luxury yacht. Jasmine scrolled through the messages, her vision blurring with hot, angry tears. Trent had not just been embezzling money to pay for Jasmine's luxury cars and country club fees. He had been secretly funneling massive amounts of stolen corporate cash to a college-aged mistress in Florida. The most recent messages were sent just 3 days ago while my Aunt Sarah was fighting for her life in my intensive care unit. Trent had wired $10,000 to Lex's offshore account, begging her to book a private flight to the Bahamas so they could disappear together before the federal authorities officially indicted him. He promised Lexi he would leave his demanding wife behind to face the bankruptcy lawyers alone. The profound depth of his betrayal shattered whatever fragile sanity Jasmine had left. She was not just losing her money. She was losing the ultimate prize she had used to taunt me for years. The perfect, wealthy white husband who supposedly provided her with a flawless life was actively planning to abandon her for a young girl using the very last scrap of stolen money he possessed. Jasmine let out a primal, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the silent house. She grabbed the half-empty heavy crystal scotch bottle from the desk and smashed it against the mahogany wood. The loud crash jolted Trent awake. He bolted upright in his chair, his bloodshot eyes wide with sudden panic. Before he could even process what was happening, Jasmine launched herself across the desk. She lunged at him with the ferocity of a wild animal, her manicured nails digging deep into his face and neck. "You filthy, lying traitor!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, striking his chest and shoulders with her fists. "You gave our money to a child. You stole from my mother and gave it to a child." Trent yelled in pain, throwing his arms up to block her frantic blows. He shoved her violently backward, sending her crashing into a tall wooden bookcase. Heavy, hardcover books rained down around her as she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Trent stood over her, wiping a thin stream of blood from a deep scratch on his cheek. He did not look apologetic. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He reached down, snatched the burner phone from the floor, and shoved it into his pocket. "You are completely insane," he spat, turning his back on her. He calmly walked out of the office and marched straight up the stairs. Jasmine scrambled to her feet and chased after him, sobbing uncontrollably. By the time she reached their massive master bedroom, Trent was already violently throwing his expensive tailored suits and leather dress shoes into a large canvas duffel bag. "Where are you going?" she cried, dropping to her knees in the doorway. "You cannot leave me here to face the FBI alone." Trent zipped the heavy bag shut and walked right past her, not even bothering to look down. "I am leaving because you are a pathetic, useless leech, Jasmine," he said coldly. "You drained me dry, and now there is absolutely nothing left. Enjoy living in your empty, repossessed house." He walked out the front door, leaving her weeping hysterically on the floor. The two security guards did not give Jasmine any time to recover from her shock. They grabbed the handles of her heavy designer suitcases and firmly escorted her out of the pristine marble lobby. Jasmine stumbled onto the immaculate sidewalk, her face burning with a profound sense of humiliation as the heavy sliding glass doors locked firmly behind her. She had just been rejected by the one person she had spent her entire life stepping on. With absolutely no money for a taxi and her phone battery blinking a desperate red, she was forced to drag her luggage down the street, walking for over an hour until her expensive heels caused her feet to bleed. She had only one option left. She had to swallow the last remaining shred of her pride and walk to our mother's house. When Jasmine finally limped up the driveway of the familiar brick colonial home, she found an environment just as devastated as her own. Patricia was sitting on the front porch steps wearing a faded bathrobe instead of her usual tailored church suits. The official notice of foreclosure was still crumpled on the lawn. The power company had just shut off the electricity because the utility bills tied to Trent's forged accounts had bounced. The two women sat together in the sweltering heat of the afternoon, completely broken and stripped of their delusions. They were starving, thirsty, and entirely broke. Patricia looked at her golden child and realized that neither of them possessed any actual survival skills. Their entire identities were built on spending money that belonged to other people. "We need cash, Jasmine," Patricia said, her voice completely flat and devoid of its usual arrogant cadence. "We cannot even buy a loaf of bread right now. We have to sell whatever we can before the bank officially locks the doors on Friday." The next morning, the neighborhood witnessed the ultimate collapse of Patricia's carefully cultivated, respectable image. Jasmine and Patricia dragged tables out onto the front lawn and covered them with their most prized possessions. Fine china crystal glasses, designer handbags, and expensive church hats were displayed on the dying grass with hastily scribbled price tags. It was a desperate garage sale born from absolute ruin. The humiliation was absolute. Women from Grace Fellowship Church, who used to sit in Patricia's living room drinking tea and gossiping, now drove slowly past the house. Some parked their cars and walked up the driveway, not to offer sympathy, but to eagerly pick through the ruins of Patricia's life, looking for cheap bargains. Jasmine stood behind a folding table, hiding her face behind dark sunglasses, praying the ground would simply open up and swallow her whole. Just as Patricia was reluctantly handing over a silver tea set to a judging neighbor, a sleek black car sped recklessly down the street. It swerved into the driveway, screeching to a violent halt, right in the middle of the garage sale. Jasmine froze. Trent threw open the driver's side door and sprinted out. He was not wearing his tailored suit. He wore dark jeans and a black hooded sweatshirt, looking panicked, sweaty, and completely deranged. He did not even look at his wife. He shoved his way past two terrified church ladies, knocking a table of crystal glasses onto the concrete driveway, where they shattered into hundreds of glittering pieces. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine screamed, chasing after him as he barged through the front door of the house. "Get out! You abandoned me!" Trent ignored her completely, taking the carpeted stairs two at a time. He ran straight into Patricia's master bedroom. By the time Jasmine and Patricia reached the top of the stairs, Trent was frantically tearing through Patricia's closet, throwing shoeboxes and clothes onto the floor. He finally found what he was looking for. He pulled out a heavy mahogany jewelry box locked with a small brass clasp. It contained pieces that had been in Patricia's family for generations, including a heavy diamond necklace that was worth tens of thousands of dollars. "Put that down right now!" Patricia shrieked, lunging into the room and grabbing the edge of the wooden box. "That is the only thing of value I have left to my name. You have stolen enough from me." Trent violently yanked the box out of her grip, shoving Patricia so hard she fell backward onto the mattress. "I need this to pay for a private flight out of the country," he yelled, his eyes wild with absolute desperation. "The feds are freezing everything. If I stay here, they are going to lock me in a cage for 20 years. This jewelry is the least you owe me for having to endure your suffocating family." Jasmine threw herself at him, grabbing his sweatshirt and clawing at his face. He hit her across the cheek with the back of his hand, sending her stumbling out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Trent sprinted down the stairs, clutching the mahogany box tightly against his chest. Jasmine and Patricia chased him out the front door, screaming at the top of their lungs. The front yard was a scene of total chaotic violence. Neighbors were standing on the sidewalk watching in stunned silence as the wealthy white son-in-law sprinted across the lawn carrying stolen goods while his wife and mother-in-law chased him in tears. Trent reached the door of his car and fumbled wildly for his keys. He did not even have time to unlock the vehicle. Without warning, three massive black sport utility vehicles turned the corner at high speed. They jumped the curb, tearing deep tracks into Patricia's manicured lawn and completely boxed in Trent's car. The doors of the heavy vehicles flew open simultaneously. A dozen armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow letters swarmed the yard. Special Agent Vance stepped out from the lead vehicle, pulling his weapon and pointing it directly at Trent's chest. "Trent Sterling, drop the box and put your hands directly on your head," Agent Vance commanded, his voice echoing like thunder across the quiet suburban street. "You are under arrest for federal medical fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." Trent froze, the heavy mahogany jewelry box slipping from his sweaty hands and crashing into the driveway, spilling diamonds and pearls across the dirty concrete. He slowly raised his trembling hands, lacing his fingers behind his head. Two federal agents moved in immediately, kicking his legs apart and slamming him hard against the side of his car. They pulled his arms back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs securely around his wrists. Jasmine and Patricia collapsed onto the front steps, holding each other and sobbing openly. The women from the church watched in absolute horrified silence as the arrogant corporate executive who had destroyed their family was shoved roughly into the back of a federal vehicle and driven away forever. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles disappeared around the corner, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. The church ladies who had eagerly picked through Patricia's belongings just moments before now slowly backed away down the driveway. They whispered furiously to one another, their eyes wide with scandalous delight, completely abandoning the woman they used to call a loyal friend. Patricia did not even have the strength to yell at them to leave her property. She sat heavily on the concrete steps, pulling her faded bathrobe tightly around her shoulders, staring blankly at the scattered diamonds and broken crystal that littered her front yard. Jasmine remained curled into a tight ball on the dying grass, shivering violently despite the sweltering afternoon heat. The golden child had finally watched her entire fraudulent world burn to the ground, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in absolute crushing despair. With the utility companies officially shutting off the water and the electricity, the massive brick colonial house became a dark, sweltering tomb. They could not flush the toilets or turn on a ceiling fan. They could not take a warm shower to wash away the grime of their garage sale humiliation. They survived on a single box of dry saltine crackers and warm tap water they had managed to save in a plastic jug before the municipal pipes ran completely dry. In the pitch-black darkness of the empty living room, the two women finally stopped pretending to be superior. Jasmine did not talk about her luxury vehicles, her expensive vacations, or her wealthy socialite friends. Patricia did not mention her pristine standing at Grace Fellowship Church or her untouchable social status. They sat together in the stifling heat, listening to the heavy silence, realizing they had absolutely nothing left to offer the world and no one left to easily manipulate. Friday morning arrived with a brutal, unforgiving humidity. It was the absolute deadline set by the bank for their immediate removal. At exactly 8 o'clock, a white county sheriff cruiser pulled into the driveway, followed closely by a large moving truck hired by First National Bank. Two armed deputies stepped out of the cruiser, their faces completely stoic and coldly professional. They marched up the steps and knocked loudly on the front door, serving the final eviction execution order directly into Patricia's trembling hands. Patricia and Jasmine were given exactly 1 hour to remove whatever personal belongings they could physically carry before the locks were officially changed and the property was permanently seized by the financial institution. The physical toll of their absolute failure was agonizing to watch. Jasmine, whose soft hands were only accustomed to swiping heavy platinum credit cards, was forced to drag heavy black trash bags filled with her remaining clothes down the carpeted stairs. Her perfectly manicured nails chipped and broke, bleeding slightly at the cuticles. Her expensive designer shoes were scuffed and covered in thick dust. Patricia struggled to carry two heavy cardboard boxes filled with old family photograph albums, which were the only memories she had left that were not entirely tainted by Trent's horrific financial crimes. The deputies stood on the front porch watching them with cold indifference, making absolutely sure they did not attempt to damage the property fixtures or steal appliances on their way out. By 9 o'clock, the heavy oak front door was slammed shut. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt echoing across the yard signaled the official end of Patricia's arrogant reign over the neighborhood. The deputies drove away, leaving Jasmine and Patricia sitting on the dirty concrete curb, surrounded by a pathetic barricade of garbage bags and crushed cardboard boxes. The morning sun beat down on them, relentlessly burning their unprotected skin. Cars drove past them, slowing down just enough for the drivers to stare at the tragic spectacle of two formerly wealthy women sitting in the filthy gutter. Patricia looked down at her hands. They were trembling uncontrollably and covered in dark dirt. She looked over at Jasmine, who was weeping silently into her hands, her blonde hair matted with sweat and grime. Patricia's toxic pride finally snapped under the immense crushing weight of reality. The massive ego that had dictated every cruel decision she had ever made completely dissolved, leaving behind only a terrified, desperate aging mother who had ruined her own life. She dug frantically through her designer purse and pulled out her cell phone. It had exactly 3% battery life remaining. Her hands shook violently as she scrolled through her contacts and pressed the call button for my personal number. I was sitting in my hospital office reviewing a complex surgical patient file when my private cell phone rang. I looked at the caller identification and let it ring 3 full times before I calmly pressed the answer button. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Chloe, my mother sobbed, her voice cracking with genuine, unfiltered agony. Please, Chloe, do not hang up on me. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I was so completely wrong about you. I favored Jasmine my entire life, and I was entirely blind to the truth. I let Trent humiliate you at that dinner, and I took his side over my own flesh and blood. I was a terrible, horrible mother, and I am paying the ultimate price for my sins right now. We have been officially evicted, Chloe. We are sitting on the curb surrounded by garbage bags. We have absolutely no money, no food, and nowhere to go. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You cannot let your own mother sleep on the dangerous street tonight. I listened to her desperate pleas, holding the phone slightly away from my ear. I did not offer any warm words of comfort or immediate forgiveness. I simply asked her to confirm her exact location, which I already knew, and ended the call with a sharp click. 20 minutes later, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulled smoothly up to the curb, where they were sitting in the sweltering heat. Jasmine gasped loudly, wiping her dirty face, assuming I had finally come to rescue them from their nightmare. She stood up quickly, grabbing the handles of her heavy trash bags, completely ready to load them into the pristine trunk of my luxury vehicle. The tinted driver's side window rolled down, but I did not unlock the passenger doors. I shifted the car into park and stepped out onto the clean sidewalk wearing a sharp, tailored designer suit. I did not look at their pathetic pile of garbage bags. I did not offer them a warm, emotional embrace. Instead, I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a thick, heavy leather legal binder, walking slowly toward the very property they had just been permanently exiled from. I walked up the cracked concrete driveway with measured, deliberate steps. The heavy leather legal binder under my arm felt like the solid weight of absolute justice. I did not wear a hospital lab coat today. I wore a sharp charcoal designer suit with pristine leather heels that clicked loudly against the pavement, echoing like a ticking clock in the suffocating heat. Jasmine and my mother sat on the filthy curb, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. They looked absolutely pathetic. Their expensive clothes were stained with sweat and dirt, and their faces were streaked with hours of desperate tears. My mother scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over a black garbage bag filled with her remaining possessions. She wiped her hands on her faded bathrobe and tried to reach out to me, her face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate relief. "Oh, Chloe," she wept, her voice cracking under the strain of her own humiliation. "You came for us. You actually came. I knew you would not let your family rot out here on the street. I knew you still had a good heart underneath all of this anger." Jasmine slowly stood up behind her, refusing to look me directly in the eye. The golden child was completely broken, her arrogant spirit crushed into fine dust. She crossed her arms over her chest and offered a weak, trembling nod, as if silently accepting my charity. I stopped exactly 5 feet away from them. I did not reach out to hold my mother's shaking hands. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply stood there looking at the massive brick colonial house that had served as my childhood prison for nearly 2 decades. The heavy oak front door was firmly shut, and a bright orange eviction notice was taped securely to the front window. "It is a beautiful day for a real estate transaction," I said, my voice perfectly level and cold. My mother blinked in confusion, her hands falling awkwardly to her sides. "What are you talking about, Chloe?" she asked, wiping a fresh tear from her dirty cheek. "We do not have time for jokes right now. The bank took everything from us. We have to load these bags into your car before the neighbors come back out and see us standing here like beggars. Please just open the trunk so we can go to your apartment." I did not unlock the car. Instead, I slowly opened the heavy leather binder and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents featuring the bold official letterhead of First National Bank. I held the documents out so my mother could clearly see the thick black signatures at the bottom of the page. I am not taking you anywhere, Mother, I replied smoothly, and I certainly do not have time for jokes. You see, when the bank officially foreclosed on this property, they were left with a massive pile of toxic bad debt that Trent fraudulently created. Banks absolutely hate holding on to bad debt. They prefer to sell it off to private real estate investment firms at a steep discount just to clear their ledgers entirely. My mother stared at the paperwork, her tired eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. She shook her head slowly, unable to process the complex financial reality of her situation. I do not understand, she whispered, her voice trembling with a new rising panic. What does an investment firm have to do with us? Why did you bring these papers here, Chloe? I snapped the leather binder shut, the sound cracking like a whip in the quiet suburban air. Because I am the investment firm mother, I stated clearly, leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding. 3 years ago, I took my surgical salary and quietly opened a private real estate limited liability company. When First National Bank listed this property on their distressed asset ledger yesterday afternoon, my holding company purchased the debt in full with a completely cash offer. I did not come here to pack your garbage bags into my car. I came here to inspect my new property. Jasmine gasped loudly, taking a sudden step backward until her calves hit the concrete curb. You bought the house? She shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical register. You bought our house and you just sat there and let the sheriff throw us out onto the street this morning. You could have stopped the eviction, Chloe. You could have saved us. I turned my cold gaze toward my older sister, watching her face twist with renewed entitled rage. I absolutely could have stopped it, Jasmine, I agreed calmly. But I chose not to. I turned back to my mother, who was staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. Do you remember my 18th birthday, Mother? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Do you remember when I told you I was switching my college major from pre-law to pre-medicine? You were absolutely furious because it ruined your perfect plan for my life. You stood right there on that front porch and you pointed your finger directly at my face. You told me that as long as I lived under your roof, I was nothing but a heavy burden and a massive disappointment. You told me that if I did not obey your exact commands, I had no right to sleep in your house. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face as the suffocating weight of her past cruelty finally crushed her. I remember she sobbed violently. I was so wrong, Chloe. I was so arrogant and foolish. Please forgive me. I looked at the massive house and then looked back at the two women standing in the gutter. You told me I was not welcome under your roof, I said, my voice echoing with 14 years of quiet, suppressed rage. So I went out and bought the roof. You are currently trespassing on my private property, and I want you off my sidewalk right now. Before my mother could drop to her knees to beg, a massive rumbling sound shook the quiet street. 3 heavy yellow construction vehicles turned the corner and drove slowly toward the house. A large bulldozer and 2 dump trucks parked directly in front of the manicured lawn. 6 men wearing hard hats and bright safety vests jumped out carrying sledgehammers and heavy demolition equipment. Jasmine screamed in absolute horror, pointing at the men. What are they doing? She demanded frantically. What is happening? I smiled for the very first time that day. They are starting the renovations, I replied, stepping back toward my Mercedes. The front porch where you used to sit and gossip about my failures is structurally unsound. It is coming down right now. Patricia and Jasmine watched in paralyzed, horrified silence as the construction crew marched right up the driveway. The foreman shouted an order, and a man swung a massive, heavy sledgehammer directly into the pristine white wooden pillars of the front porch. The wood splintered and cracked with a loud, violent snap. The ultimate symbol of my mother's arrogant social status was physically shattered right in front of her weeping eyes, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The heavy wooden pillars of the front porch splintered with a deafening crack that echoed down the entire suburban block. The ornate overhang my mother used to decorate with expensive seasonal garlands groaned under the immense structural strain, before collapsing violently into a massive cloud of thick gray dust. Jasmine let out a piercing shriek and covered her ears, pressing her back against a street lamp. My mother fell directly to her knees on the dirty concrete sidewalk, her hands grasping wildly at empty air as the dust rolled over her faded bathrobe. I stood completely still beside my Mercedes-Benz, untouched by the debris, watching the physical manifestation of my childhood trauma being ripped apart by heavy machinery. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The sheer violence of the demolition naturally drew an audience. The wealthy neighbors finally stepped out onto their manicured lawns. More importantly, the group of gossiping women from Grace Fellowship Church who lingered down the street after the disastrous garage sale began creeping back toward the property. They clustered near the driveway, their eyes wide with scandalous curiosity. My mother immediately noticed her congregation members watching. Even sitting in the filthy gutter, completely bankrupt, her toxic instinct to preserve her public image flared to life. She scrambled to her feet, coughing through the thick dust, and pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Look at what she is doing," my mother wailed, turning toward the church ladies with a theatrical sob. "Look at my ungrateful daughter. She bought her mother's house just to maliciously destroy it out of spite. She is tearing down our family history because she is a bitter, vindictive girl. Please call the police and stop her." The church ladies murmured among themselves, looking between my tailored suit and my mother's filthy bathrobe. I did not let my mother control the narrative for a second. I stepped away from my vehicle and walked closer to the crowd of neighbors, raising my voice so every single person on the street could hear me clearly. "I am not destroying this property," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute clinical authority. "The residential facade is simply being removed because the building must be entirely gutted to comply with commercial medical zoning laws." My mother stopped crying, her face twisting in confusion. "Commercial medical zoning," she echoed, wiping her dirty nose with the back of her hand. "What on earth are you talking about, Chloe? Why would you need medical zoning for a residential house?" I turned to face her, making sure the ladies from Grace Fellowship Church were hanging on to every word. "Because this property will no longer be a private residence," I explained smoothly. "Starting next month, this estate will officially become the Memorial Hospital Outpatient Rehabilitation Center. It will be a completely free state-of-the-art medical clinic dedicated entirely to serving low-income, marginalized patients from the city." A loud gasp rippled through the crowd of churchwomen. Charity work was the pinnacle of social currency in their community, and I had just announced a philanthropic project of massive proportions. But I was not finished. More specifically, I continued locking eyes with my mother. This free clinic will specialize in providing intense physical therapy and corrective surgeries for innocent patients who were permanently injured by defective medical equipment. Patients who were paralyzed because greedy corporate executives pushed faulty titanium implants into their spines to make a quick profit. Executives exactly like your beloved son-in-law, Trent Sterling. The reaction from this neighborhood was immediate and devastating for my mother. The church ladies physically recoiled as the undeniable truth washed over them. Patricia was not a tragic victim of an unexpected financial crisis. She had knowingly basked in the stolen wealth of a man who crippled innocent people. Her luxury vehicles, her expensive church hats, and the very house she was crying over were entirely funded by the bloody profits of federal medical fraud. "You cannot do this," my mother whispered, her voice completely devoid of any remaining strength. "You cannot turn my home into a public clinic. All of my friends will know. My reputation will be completely ruined." "Your reputation was built on stolen money and lies, Mother," I replied coldly. "Trent broke innocent people to pay for this house. Now I am going to use this house to heal the people he broke. It is the only way to cleanse the rot from this property." My mother looked desperately toward the women from her church, holding her hands out in a silent plea for sympathy. But the social execution was already complete. The ladies of Grace Fellowship Church turned their backs on her in perfect unison. They whispered furiously among themselves, nodding approvingly at me, the saintly surgeon, before quickly walking away down the street. They did not offer Patricia a place to stay. They did not offer her a ride. They completely erased her from their social registry right there on the sidewalk. Jasmine, who had been watching the entire exchange in terrified silence, slowly slid down the street lamp and sat back down on the curb. She buried her face in her knees, accepting that there was no magical rescue coming. The golden child and the arrogant matriarch were completely alone, isolated in the gutter of the neighborhood they used to rule. I turned my back on them and walked toward my car. I opened the door to my Mercedes and slid into the cool leather driver's seat. I rolled down the window one final time, looking at the two broken women sitting next to their pathetic pile of garbage bags. "The demolition crew will be working until 5 o'clock," I stated calmly, starting the quiet engine of my vehicle. "I highly suggest you gather your trash and find a homeless shelter before it gets dark." I rolled up the tinted window, cutting off the sound of my mother's agonizing sobs. I drove away forever. I drove away from that crumbling colonial house, feeling lighter than I had in my entire life. The heavy, suffocating burden of seeking validation from a family that despised me was finally gone. I returned to my penthouse and poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, looking out over the glittering city skyline. I had completely severed the infected tissue, and now the real healing could begin. Over the next several weeks, the wealthy suburban neighborhood where I grew up was completely transformed by the relentless sounds of heavy construction. The massive brick house was gutted down to its wooden studs. The perfectly manicured lawn, where my mother used to host her exclusive garden parties, was dug up and paved over to create an accessible parking lot for medical transport vans. The rumor mill in the neighborhood was spinning completely out of control. The wealthy residents and the gossiping ladies from Grace Fellowship Church drove past the property every single day, trying to figure out exactly what the disgraced neurosurgeon daughter was building on the ruins of her mother's empire. I let them wonder for an entire month. I wanted the anticipation to build. When the exterior renovations were finally complete, I sent formal printed invitations to every single house on the block, and specifically to the pastoral staff at Grace Fellowship Church. I invited them to attend the official ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new property. I knew their insatiable curiosity and their love for community events would absolutely guarantee a massive turnout. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the front lawn was completely packed with local politicians, hospital board members, and every single nosy neighbor who had watched my mother get evicted. I stood on the newly built, reinforced concrete ramp that replaced the wooden front porch, wearing my white hospital lab coat over a tailored black suit. A large red silk ribbon was stretched across the brand new sliding glass double doors. I stepped up to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. The crowd went completely silent, hanging on to my every word. I welcomed them to the grand opening of the Memorial Hospital Outpatient Rehabilitation Center. I explained that this facility was entirely funded by my private real estate company and fully staffed by volunteer medical professionals from my surgical department. I looked directly into the crowd, making deliberate eye contact with the women who used to drink tea with my mother. I told them that this clinic had one specific mission. It was designed to provide free state-of-the-art physical therapy and corrective spinal surgery to marginalized, low-income patients. But more importantly, I explained that our primary patient demographic would be the innocent people who were permanently paralyzed and maimed by defective titanium spinal implants. I did not shy away from the brutal truth. I spoke clearly into the microphone, making sure my voice carried across the entire street. I told the crowd that these defective medical devices were knowingly sold by a corrupt corporate executive named Trent Sterling. The crowd gasped collectively. I explained how Trent had knowingly ruined lives to line his own pockets and fund a fraudulent, lavish lifestyle. I told them how he had embezzled millions and terrorized his own family. I pointed to the newly painted walls of the clinic and declared that the only way to wash away the deep stain of his horrific crimes was to turn the very property his dirty money had funded into a sanctuary for his victims. I told the neighborhood that from this day forward, the Sterling family legacy would no longer be associated with greed and fake respectability, but with genuine healing and absolute accountability. The response from the community was absolutely deafening. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The local news cameras flashed, capturing every single moment of my speech. The head pastor of Grace Fellowship Church, the very same man who had tried to guilt-trip me at Sunday dinner, walked up to the podium and publicly shook my hand. He grabbed the microphone and loudly proclaimed that I was a true blessing to the city. He praised my selflessness and my dedication to the medical profession. In the eyes of the entire community, I was instantly elevated to the status of a living saint. I had taken a massive public scandal and transformed it into a beacon of hope. But the absolute sweetest part of that morning was the final, undeniable destruction of my mother's social standing. The church ladies clustered together, whispering furiously. The narrative was completely sealed. Patricia was no longer viewed as a tragic victim who had been fooled by a bad son-in-law. Because she had fought so hard to defend him, and because she had publicly demanded that I sign his fraudulent contracts, the community completely turned against her. They decided she was a willing enabler. They concluded that Patricia and Jasmine knew exactly where the dirty money was coming from, and simply did not care as long as they got to keep their luxury cars and country club memberships. Their beloved respectability, the fake image they had sacrificed my entire childhood to maintain, was completely and permanently destroyed. Whenever anyone in that wealthy suburb spoke the name Patricia or Jasmine, they spoke it with absolute disgust. They were remembered as the greedy, selfish women who enabled a criminal monster. Meanwhile, my name was etched in bronze on the front of the new medical clinic. I grabbed a pair of large silver scissors and cut the red silk ribbon to the sound of cheering crowds. The heavy glass doors slid open, revealing a bright, clean medical facility filled with state-of-the-art rehabilitation equipment. Patients in wheelchairs were already being wheeled inside by smiling nurses. I stood on the ramp watching the healing begin. I had finally taken the exact place where I was told I was worthless and turned it into a beautiful monument of my enduring strength. 6 months passed since the grand opening of the clinic. The sweltering heat of that dramatic summer had completely given way to the bitter freezing winds of a relentless winter. While my new rehabilitation center thrived and brought genuine healing to the community, Trent Sterling was experiencing a completely different kind of sterile environment. His day of absolute reckoning had finally arrived inside the towering federal courthouse downtown. The heavy mahogany walls and cold marble floors of the courtroom offered absolutely no comfort. I walked through the heavy double doors wearing a sharp navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight. The room was packed with journalists, former corporate colleagues, and several of the victims who had been permanently injured by his greed. I took a seat in the front row right behind the prosecutor's table. I looked across the aisle and saw Trent sitting at the defense table. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant corporate director who used to wear custom-tailored silk suits and mock my hospital salary was completely gone. In his place sat a hollow, terrified man wearing an ill-fitting gray suit provided by the state. His blonde hair was thinning and unwashed, and his skin had a sickly pale pallor. His team of expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers had abandoned him months ago, the very second they realized his bank accounts were entirely frozen and his retainer checks would bounce. He was left with a single exhausted public defender who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. The bailiff announced the arrival of the federal judge, and the entire courtroom rose to its feet. The judge was an older, stern woman with a reputation for handing down maximum penalties for white-collar crimes that resulted in physical harm. She took her seat at the high bench and adjusted her glasses, looking down at Trent with a mixture of profound disappointment and cold disgust. The prosecution immediately called their primary expert medical witness to the stand. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked confidently across the room to the witness box. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with a commanding presence, approached the podium and asked me to state my name and professional credentials for the official court record. "I am Dr. Chloe," I stated clearly, my voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "I am the chief of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital and the founder of the Memorial Outpatient Rehabilitation Center." The prosecutor nodded and handed me a thick binder filled with technical schematics and surgical photographs. Dr. Chloe, she began, her tone deadly serious. The defendant has continuously claimed that the failure of his titanium spinal implants was a tragic manufacturing anomaly. As an expert in neurosurgery and spinal biomechanics, can you please explain to the court exactly why these specific devices failed catastrophically in so many innocent patients? I opened the binder, but I did not need to look at the pages. I knew the devastating data by heart. I looked directly at the judge and began to methodically and coldly dissect Trent's entire fraudulent enterprise. These failures were not anomalies, Your Honor, I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. These implants failed because they were deliberately manufactured using a substandard cheap metal alloy to aggressively cut production costs. When placed under standard human weight-bearing pressure, the titanium threading along the primary anchor points would systematically shear off. I paused, letting the heavy technical reality sink in before translating it into the horrifying human cost. When those threads snapped, the metal plates would violently shift inside the patient's spinal column. This caused catastrophic severing of the spinal cord, severe cerebrospinal fluid leaks, and massive internal hemorrhaging. The pain experienced by these patients is entirely indescribable. I turned my head and looked directly at Trent. He shrank down in his chair, avoiding my gaze entirely. The defendant knew about this metallurgical weakness. I continued, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. He had access to the internal engineering reports warning of these exact catastrophic failures. But instead of recalling the dangerous equipment, he deliberately suppressed the safety data. He authorized the continued sale of these defective implants to low-income hospitals, specifically targeting vulnerable, marginalized populations who lacked the resources to sue his corporation. He knowingly traded the mobility and the lives of innocent people for his own personal financial gain. He crippled human beings so he could buy luxury sports cars and maintain a fraudulent social image. The courtroom was dead silent. A few of the victims in the gallery were quietly weeping. The public defender did not even attempt to cross-examine me. He knew any questions would only allow me to inflict more damage on his client's non-existent character. I was dismissed from the stand and walked back to my seat, feeling a profound sense of closure. The judge shuffled her papers and looked down at Trent. "Mr. Sterling, please stand," she commanded sharply. Trent stood up, his knees visibly shaking. He opened his mouth to offer a pathetic, rehearsed apology, but the judge held up her hand, stopping him instantly. "I have presided over this court for 20 years, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice filled with righteous anger. "I have seen drug dealers and violent criminals stand exactly where you are standing. But your crime is a unique kind of pure, unadulterated evil. You used the sacred trust of the medical profession to mutilate innocent people just to line your own pockets. You are a predator dressed in a corporate suit." She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "For the charges of federal medical fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud, I sentence you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary," she declared loudly. "Because this is a federal sentence, there is absolutely no possibility of early parole. You will serve every single day of those 15 years behind bars." The gavel slammed down with a loud, violent crack, sealing his fate forever. Two massive federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Trent by his arms and pulling his hands behind his back to apply the heavy steel handcuffs. Trent looked completely panicked, his chest heaving, as the reality of a decade and a half in a concrete cell finally crushed him. As the marshals dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells, he desperately turned his head toward the back of the courtroom, searching for a single shred of comfort. Jasmine was sitting in the very last row of the gallery. She was wearing a faded polyester uniform from her new minimum wage job, her blonde hair tied back in a messy knot. Trent looked right at her, his eyes begging for her to acknowledge him, to offer him one last look of love, or even pity. But Jasmine did not move. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead at the blank mahogany wall. She did not blink. She did not shed a tear. She did not even turn her head to watch her husband be dragged away into the darkness. She was completely empty. Jasmine remained frozen in that hard wooden pew long after the courtroom had completely emptied. The federal bailiff eventually had to walk over, tap her on the shoulder, and sternly ask her to exit the premises. Walking out into the freezing winter air of the city, she realized her old identity was entirely dead. The golden child of the Sterling family had evaporated the moment the judge brought the heavy gavel down. Over the next year, the cold, harsh reality of her new socioeconomic status settled over her like a suffocating heavy blanket. With absolutely no college degree, no marketable skills, and a resume consisting only of organizing luxury charity galas, Jasmine found herself tumbling down the employment ladder at a terrifying speed. She applied for high-end retail positions and corporate event planning roles, but her undeniable association with Trent's highly publicized federal fraud case made her completely unemployable in any luxury circles. Desperation and impending starvation finally forced her to accept the only position willing to hire a disgraced felon's wife. Every morning at 5 o'clock, Jasmine woke up in a cramped studio apartment that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap cooking oil. She dragged herself out of a sagging twin bed and put on her required work uniform. It was a scratchy, ill-fitting light blue polyester scrub top with a cheap plastic name tag pinned crookedly to the chest. She had to take 2 separate crowded public buses just to get to her job. She stood shivering in the freezing rain, waiting for the transit system to arrive, surrounded by the very working-class people she used to turn her nose up at. She learned how to balance her weight on the swaying bus, holding onto the cold metal handrails that always left a metallic smell on her hands. Jasmine, the woman who used to wear custom silk dresses and drive a $100,000 Porsche, now spent her days sitting behind a scratched plexiglass window. She was a front desk receptionist at a heavily underfunded public health clinic on the far south side of the city. It was the exact job she and her mother had relentlessly mocked me for supposedly having. The universe has an incredibly dark and poetic sense of humor. The clinic itself was a chaotic symphony of human suffering and administrative panic. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, casting a sickly yellow glow over the stained waiting room chairs. Jasmine spent 8 hours a day answering relentlessly ringing phones, filing thick paper medical charts, and being yelled at by frustrated sick patients who had been sitting in the waiting room for hours. She had to endure the condescending tones of exhausted doctors who did not have the time or patience to coddle her fragile ego. One Tuesday afternoon, a wealthy woman walked into the clinic looking for directions to a private specialist office nearby. The woman was wearing the exact same designer perfume Jasmine used to buy and carried a leather handbag Jasmine used to own. Jasmine tried to offer a polite customer service smile, but the woman simply snapped her fingers, pointing impatiently at a map and treating Jasmine like an invisible piece of talking furniture. Jasmine felt a hot tear slide down her cheek as she handed the woman a pen. She finally understood the agonizing sting of being treated as completely worthless based solely on a job title. She was forced to swallow her pride every single day just to earn enough minimum wage to keep the electricity turned on in her miserable apartment. She was utterly and entirely humbled. While Jasmine endured the daily public humiliation of the working class, our mother Patricia was suffocating under the weight of total isolation. Following the brutal foreclosure of the massive colonial estate and her subsequent excommunication from Grace Fellowship Church, Patricia was forced to relocate to a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a decaying concrete complex. She no longer had her pristine manicured lawn or her heated swimming pool. She had a cracked asphalt parking lot filled with rusted vehicles and overflowing dumpsters. The walls of her apartment were paper-thin. She could hear her neighbors arguing, the constant blaring of televisions, and the violent rattling of the ancient heating pipes. She survived on canned soup and discount bread, carefully calculating the cost of every single meal because her meager Social Security check barely covered the exorbitant rent. She had absolutely no visitors. The women who used to drink expensive tea in her pristine living room crossed the street if they ever saw her walking to the discount grocery store. Patricia's phone rang dozens of times a day, but she never answered it. The calls were an endless, relentless barrage of aggressive debt collectors trying to squeeze blood from a stone. Trent had completely destroyed her credit score and left her buried under a mountain of fraudulent financial liabilities. She kept the blinds tightly drawn, refusing to look out the window, terrified that a process server or a bank representative was waiting for her in the parking lot. She spent her days sitting in a cheap folding chair, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, surrounded by the suffocating silence of a woman who had alienated everyone who ever truly loved her. The absolute crushing loneliness eventually pushed Patricia to the breaking point. On a rainy Thursday evening, she dug through her small plastic purse and pulled out a cheap prepaid cellular phone. Her hands shook violently as she manually dialed my private phone number. It was the only number she still had memorized. She held the plastic device to her ear, her heart pounding with a desperate, foolish hope. She was ready to beg. She was ready to apologize 1,000 times over for every cruel thing she had ever done. She thought that perhaps the passage of an entire year had softened my heart. She prayed that the daughter she threw away would suddenly rush in to save her from this miserable existence. She closed her eyes, waiting for the familiar ringing tone. Instead, she was met with a sharp mechanical click, followed by a sterile, automated voice. "We are sorry, but the number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Patricia dropped the phone. It clattered against the cheap linoleum floor, breaking into two pieces. I had not just ignored her call, I had completely erased her from my existence, changing my number and ensuring she could never infect my life again. She covered her face with her hands and wept loudly into the empty, noisy apartment. Neither Jasmine nor Patricia had died. Their physical hearts were still beating inside their chests, but they were trapped in a permanent, agonizing purgatory. They were living the exact, impoverished, invisible life they used to so arrogantly mock. 2 years after that freezing winter day, the narrative of my life shifted completely to unprecedented triumph. The suffocating atmosphere of my childhood trauma was entirely replaced by the crisp, pristine air of Geneva. I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Palais des Nations, attending the Global Summit for Medical Innovation. The sheer scale of the event was breathtaking. Thousands of the most brilliant medical minds from across the globe were gathered under massive, sparkling crystal chandeliers. I was not there as a mere attendee. I was the guest of honor. The Memorial Outpatient Rehabilitation Center had become a massive international success story. My surgical protocols had been adopted by hospitals, and tonight the World Medical Association was presenting me with their highest award for surgical excellence. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtain waiting for my name to be announced. I looked out past the heavy fabric into the front row of the massive auditorium. My biological mother and sister were thousands of miles away, but I was not alone. The front row was completely filled with my actual family. Dr. Elias Sterling sat there beaming with profound pride. Beside him sat head nurse Brenda, the fierce, dedicated woman who had handed me my chief of surgery coat. And sitting right in the center, radiating a quiet, enduring strength, was Aunt Sarah. The frail, terrified woman who had collapsed on the floor of that steakhouse was completely gone. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, her silver hair perfectly styled. She smiled at me, her eyes shining with unspeakable pride and genuine love. A sudden hush fell over the grand ballroom as the president of the World Medical Association stepped up to the crystal podium. He spoke eloquently about the incredible resilience of the human spirit and our duty to heal. When he finally announced my name, the entire room erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. The sound was deafening, washing over me like a massive wave of absolute validation. I walked out from behind the velvet curtain, the heavy silk of my designer evening gown flowing elegantly behind me. I climbed the short steps to the brightly lit stage, shaking the president's hand and accepting the heavy gold and crystal trophy. I stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the sea of brilliant faces. The applause slowly faded into an expectant, reverent silence. "Thank you," I began, my voice ringing clear and strong. "I accept this profound honor not just for myself, but for the countless patients who trusted me with their fragile spines when the rest of the world had completely abandoned them. They are the true heroes of this story." I paused, looking directly at Aunt Sarah in the front row. For many years, I lived my life believing that I was fundamentally flawed. I was told repeatedly by the people who were supposed to love me most that I was a burden, a failure, and a constant disappointment. I spent my youth desperately trying to earn a seat at a table where I was never actually welcome. I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. As surgeons, we are intimately familiar with the concept of necrosis. I continued, my tone shifting into a deeply serious clinical cadence that commanded absolute attention. We know that when a localized area of tissue becomes infected and begins to die, it releases highly toxic enzymes into the surrounding healthy areas. If left untreated, that toxic rot will relentlessly spread, poisoning the bloodstream and eventually destroying the entire host body. We know that the only way to truly save the patient is to make a clean surgical cut. You must completely sever the necrotic tissue, no matter how painful that amputation might be. You cannot negotiate with a spreading infection. You cannot love a rotting limb back to health. You must aggressively remove it so the rest of the body can finally heal. The auditorium was completely silent, captivated by the raw, intense truth of the metaphor. For a very long time, I allowed toxic necrotic relationships to infect my own life, I stated proudly. But true family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the genuine desire to see you succeed. Sometimes, the most profound healing begins the exact moment you finally find the courage to cut the dead weight loose. I raised the heavy crystal award high into the air. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are worthless, simply because they lack the vision to see your incredible value. Build your own table, find your own people, and never apologize for protecting your peace. The ballroom exploded into a second passionate standing ovation. I smiled, stepping back from the podium and walking gracefully off the stage. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the familiar heavy vibration of my hospital pager buzzed aggressively against my hip. For 14 years, that specific buzzing sound had triggered a massive rush of adrenaline, signaling a surgical emergency. I reached down and pulled the device from the hidden pocket of my gown. The screen did not flash, with a terrifying red code black. The text scrolled across the small digital display in soft, glowing letters. It was a message from David, the brilliant, compassionate pediatric cardiologist I had met during my clinic renovations. He was not just a colleague, he was my fiercely loving fiancé. The message read simply, "I am watching the live stream from the hotel suite, and I have never been more incredibly proud of you. Hurry back upstairs to me, my beautiful, brilliant wife." I clipped the pager back onto my waist, a warm, profound sense of absolute peace settling deep into my bones. The dark, desperate shadows of my past were entirely gone forever, replaced by a blindingly bright, limitless future. This was my real, beautiful life now. I had finally achieved my total, absolute victory, and nobody could ever take it away from me ever again. The most profound lesson to be drawn from Chloe's journey is the liberating, though often painful, necessity of severing toxic ties to protect your own peace, even when those ties are biological. Society frequently pushes the narrative that family is an unbreakable bond, implying we must endure endless disrespect simply because of shared DNA. However, Chloe's story powerfully dismantles that myth, proving that true family is defined by mutual respect, unconditional support, and a genuine desire to see you thrive. When you are cast in the role of the scapegoat, constantly belittled and drained by the very people who should protect you, holding on to those relationships out of mere obligation only poisons your potential. Chloe's medical metaphor of necrotic tissue perfectly encapsulates this reality. You cannot love a rotting limb back to health. You must cleanly amputate it to save the rest of the body from a spreading infection. Similarly, establishing unapologetic, ironclad boundaries with abusive or manipulative relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Chloe's absolute victory didn't come from finally earning her mother and sister's validation. It came from realizing their validation was entirely worthless because it was built on a foundation of lies, greed, and superficial respectability. By cutting them off, she made space to build her own table, surround herself with a chosen family that truly valued her, and repurpose her childhood trauma into a monument of healing for others. Her story is a testament to the fact that your worth is never determined by those who are too blind to recognize it. Take a fearless inventory of the relationships in your life today and boldly establish the boundaries you need to protect your peace.